startled when I felt a soft touch on my face, my damp face. Jesus, when had I started crying? And why in God's name was I leaning into the man's touch instead of pulling away from it? Why did I want to press my head against his stomach and wrap my arms around him and beg him to do the same to me? Why did I want him to promise he'd help me find the child who was the only bright spot in my life, who trusted me to take care of her and love her and keep her safe? "It'll be okay, Ben." It took a good 15 seconds for his words to register. Well, one word in particular. I made myself pull back so his calloused thumb was no longer tracing the path of my silent tears. "How do you know my name?" I asked, as I shifted farther back on the bed. Something else registered in that moment, too, and I felt fear skate up my spine. "You said take me back to the hospital. How do you know I was in the hospital?" I tried to move even farther away from him, but my pained body wasn't having it. When the man suddenly reached for me, I managed to jerk away, but it cost me. I cried out in pain at the same time that I spilled the bottle of water all over myself. The man put his hands up. The whole thing was almost comical because he physically outmatched me in just about every possible way, and he was acting like me and my nearly empty bottle of water could take him. He was several inches taller than me and probably weighed a good 40 or 50 pounds more. Muscles bulged beneath the sleeves of his long-sleeved white Henley. He was broad-chested, and his light brown hair was closely cropped in what looked like a military-style cut. His ocean blue eyes were fringed with dark lashes, and there was just a hint of laugh lines crinkling the corners of his eyes, though I guessed it was his age rather than a sense of humor that had played into that little physical detail. My gut was telling me he wasn't much of a laugher. "You told me your name," the man said. I went to deny that, because ever since Georgie had been taken, I'd been careful not to tell anyone anything. That had been part of the instructions her kidnappers had given. But with my head spinning like it was, and my not remembering much about the events of the evening, I had to assume the hospital had managed to get some heavy-duty painkillers into me at some point without me realizing it. "And the hospital?" I asked. The man slowly knelt on the ground next to the bed, and then very carefully reached toward me. It was all I could do not to pull away. I half expected him to touch my face again, maybe even welcomed the idea a little, but he went for my shirt collar instead. "You left this on," he said, as he gave something beneath my collar a tug. I looked down and saw his tanned fingers touching a thin layer of fabric beneath my shirt. My hospital gown. I'd forgotten that I hadn't been able to get the thing off since I'd been in such a hurry to get out of the room before a nurse or doctor came back, so I just tugged my clothes on over it. Fortunately, my shirt had been the button-up kind, so I'd been able to get that on without too much trouble, though I had to wonder if such a thing would have been possible if I hadn't been on the painkillers. The man removed his hand, taking the bottle of water from my lax one in the process. He handed me a second full bottle and removed the cap for me. "Drink some more," he said, once again in that weird tone that wasn't quite an order but wasn't really a request either. My head had finally stopped spinning, and my stomach felt a little better, so I did as he said. "What's your name?" I asked. I saw something flash in his eyes, but wasn't sure what it was. My eyes skittered to his hands when he absent-mindedly began tugging at his shirt sleeves as if trying to pull them down farther. It was an odd gesture, but I figured everyone had their weird little quirks, so I did my best to ignore it. "Reese," he finally said. He seemed to wait for something after telling me his name, but I wasn't sure what. "Reese," I murmured. I knew I needed to thank him for helping me, though in truth I wasn't sure what exactly he'd helped me with. I closed my eyes as I tried to pull up the events of whatever had happened between me leaving the hospital and waking up in the motel room.